by the petty bourgeois elements in our society. The African bourgeoisie is the most corrupt bourgeoisie in the world. In Africa, they seek luxury in the midst of mass suffering. For what is what, I ain't trying to round my luck, this game up. I ain't trying to show skills till the brothers paid up. Emotions got me feeling like one time, like a fade up. I wanna talk all that money, but I ain't got my weight up. Now I see life like training knuckles, seeing a fist fight. The insight that I acquire from the skills and eyesight. The street life you glorify is a mean life. The weak, strong, wicked, everybody living still dies. Back in the days I used to master these rap shit, rapping fantastic. Flick words like vocal gymnastics. Started with some slow words like nigga is spastic. I melt mics with these words like fire to plastic. I really miss them days. We used to throw dice. Barefooted, now we making dough. We're buying 2 nights. Taking misses on the cruise. Dinner in the moonlight. We having dinner stuck in black. It still be like 2 shots. But you must not think that they represent the people. They only represent their opportunistic self, using the people every step of the way. And you, I'm sleeping, I'm falling, I'm reaching out the higher powers. What's good, African family? Welcome back to the African Wahala. So we're going to have a conversation about the South African Expropriation Act 13 of 2024. What exactly is the act? Why is it causing so much fuzz, fuming amongst a certain group of people? They are even beginning to use their powers to support their people. In this case, I'm talking about the United States of America. We have this lady that goes by the name Tammy Bruce. She's the spokesperson of the State Department in the US, and she says the United States stands ready to help the descendants of settlers in South Africa who are being expropriated and abused by South African government. Pursuant to President Trump's executive order, the State Department is suspending all non-life-saving aid to the Republic of South Africa. Persecuted South African farmers and their innocent victims other innocent victims being solely based on their race who choose to resettle in America will be welcome. The United States will also defend the rights of and interest of those remaining descendants of settlers threatened with expropriation without compensation and other intolerable abuses. We will no longer stand while God-given rights are so cruelly violated. There are so many things wrong about this statement from Tammy Bruce, but the good thing is she is speaking the mind of herself, of a lot of government officials in America, and how they view the world. So, in my opinion, this is good because it allows a lot of people that look up to these people to know their true colors. And even with these types of exposition, their worshippers, especially the African people, they are not still going to stop worshiping them because they view them as gods, as people that are pure and can do no wrong. Now, if the settlers in South Africa, we are talking about the European settlers, mostly from Netherlands and England. They went to South Africa during the time of colonization. They went all across Africa, to be fair. One of the reasons they decided to stay put in South Africa is because the land in South Africa is quite green, very, very productive, rich in mineral resources. The climate is very, very mild. You know, it's not comparable to what we have in West Africa with the extreme heat, mosquitoes. You know, back then when the European settlers, they were not even settlers. They were pretty much terrorists, okay? Conquering and killing and raping and, you know, committing all types of atrocities.
They got to southern part of Africa, and with their animals, their cattle, their bulls, they had a better chance of surviving because the climate was just nice. It wasn't as hot. They didn't have as much, mosquitoes and all these types of pathogens that would cause problems. So they ended up staying in South Africa, and that's the part of Africa where they stayed put the most. Countries like Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana, they have a lot of settlers in those parts of Africa. Now, this is 2025, and nobody is really, I'm not going to say nobody, I would speak for the African Wahala. The African Wahala is not really speaking to, crush people and destroy people because of what their ancestors did necessarily, but it's only right for there to be some sort of readjustment in the system to make up for the unfair treatment of the people in those geographical locations. There has to be some sort of government enforced methodologies to reshuffle the wealth. It's not a secret today that South Africa, even though the population of Europeans is probably less than 10%, they control over 50% of the wealth and the industries in the country, while the African indigenous people still are the poorest in the country. I mean, it is what it is. It's unfortunate, but that's just what the truth is. So with the United States, the almighty United States, one of the most powerful countries of the world, coming to support the descendants of the settlers in this Trump administration, wouldn't that be what we refer to as pure nepotism? They are accusing the South African government of nepotism because they have implemented the Expropriation Act to reshuffle wealth and bring about more equity. But that is triggering anger amongst the American government officials in the Trump administration. This lady, Tammy Bruce, she's talking about persecuted South African farmers and other innocent victims being targeted solely based on their race. Now, if we go back to the past, wasn't it based on race that the settlers violently took over the land in the first place? But it doesn't matter because these guys are going to come together and support themselves. And it's unfortunate that African countries, African people are still not in that position to be able to protect ourselves like we're supposed to. That's why if the Europeans are protecting themselves, it shouldn't come as a surprise. The United States will also defend the rights and interests of those remaining descendants of settlers threatened with expropriation. Did the United States, now this is a curious question, did the United States ever come to the defense of the indigenous African people that were victims of these violent settlers in the first place? I don't think that happened. They propped up Nelson Mandela, pushed him to the world as the perfect person to end apartheid and create a country that is good for everyone in South Africa, but that hasn't been the case. African indigenous South Africans are still at the bottom of the food chain in South Africa, even though they make up easily 85% of the population. And this is on the continent of Africa. We have this other guy, Secretary Marco Rubio. He says, I will not attend the G20 summit in Johannesburg. South Africa is doing very bad things, expropriating private property, using G20 to promote solidarity, equity, sustainability. In other words, DEI and climate change. DEI means diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's an American terminology. But they believe that their American terminology is being implemented in South Africa. He says, my job is to advance America's national interest, not waste taxpayers' money on coddle anti-Americanism. Well, Marco Rubio, thank you for not showing up in South Africa. You were not even invited in the first place. And even if you were invited, it was simply what we call eye service in Nigeria. Nobody really cares about your presence, to be honest. And I feel like this is also a great opportunity for us to fall back on all these fake aids coming from countries like the United States of America. We also heard about Donald Trump promising to implement some sanctions on South Africa because of this expropriation situation. And we're going to get into the details of the expropriation. What exactly is happening? What is it about?
1910, when the Union of South Africa. How did white South Africans get so wealthy? South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. And it freaks me out how many South Africans complain about BEE, or they say 30 years of democracy, isn't that enough for you? In exactly that accent. And how little most South Africans know about economic apartheid. How far colonial and apartheid governments went to lift up white people and suppress people of color for hundreds of years. Your parents may have worked hard, very hard. But the paler their skin, the more they benefited from extraordinary government economic aid.
And it's the same thing going on right now with the United States. And we all know that the United States is slowly falling. It's no longer the giant that it was. It's still a giant, don't get it wrong, but it's slowly falling. We all can see what is going on in the world, okay? We have countries and blocks, countries like China, blocks like BRICS, China merging with Brazil, Russia, and South Africa. They've come together for their economic prosperity, and it's going to have a detrimental impact on the powers of United States of America. With what this guy just said about the paler your skin, the more opportunities you have in South Africa, it's the same exact situation playing out with the Trump administration members openly threatening South Africa for implementing a law in its country that would be beneficial for the vast majority of the people.
So let's start in 1910, when the Union of South Africa was formed. Literally, the country was invented for the first time, and government policies affected everybody in the country. The Second South African War had just ended. It was between the Brits and the Boers, and the Brits won, but they wanted to unite all white people together, especially Afrikaners, because they'd been fighting each other and killing each other for years. And so immediately, they made it that no people of color could vote. Instantly, unite the white people, only they can vote, only they can control the making of the new country. Then in
So, with this type of history of obviously violence, brutality against African people, and the African people coming together in 2025 to implement laws to protect them or to reverse the unequal dynamics that has been playing on in the country, there is absolutely nothing wrong in that. But the almighty United States feels like, yes, it's wrong. You have to make sure that you maintain the era of on inequities. You have to make sure that you maintain how the African people remain at the bottom of the food chain while the Europeans in South Africa remain on top. That's what the United States wants, the United States of America's government.
In 1913, the Land Act made it illegal, impossible for black people to own land outside of reserves. That meant 93% of all land in South Africa was only available to white people. Then, in the early 1920s, poor white Afrikaners protested that most of big industry was dominated by British companies, and those companies were hiring skilled black workers over them. In response, the government funded enormous public works programs, like building the Hartbeespoort Dam, and they only hired poor white workers. They literally made programs to make jobs for poor white, particularly Afrikaner workers. Also in 1925, the Wage Act made a minimum wage for white workers, but not black workers. And the government offered incentives to companies applying for tenders. The more white workers you employ, the more likely you are to win work. Let's jump to 1948, when the National Party returns to power and formalizes apartheid for the very first time. And the first thing they do is direct massive funding to social programs and welfare grants for poor white people and slashed funding for people of color across the board. In the 1950s and 60s, the apartheid government fixed black people's pensions, which meant that as inflation increased, the value of those pensions got less. At the same time, white people's pensions increased dramatically.
So this is just an example of some of the inequities that has been going on in South Africa, that the government, for the first time, they are being responsible because for the most part, African governments are irresponsible. For the most part, we're not going to pretend like Cyril Ramaphosa or 99% of these sub-Saharan African country leaders are responsible. For the most part, they are not. Okay. But they are doing something this time around. I'm talking about Cyril Ramaphosa's government of South Africa to establish equity in a system that is always unequal. But let's go into the details of the Expropriation Act. So the purpose of the act was to basically reshuffle land ownership. Okay. Also, it repeals the most recent Apartheid Era Expropriation Act 63 of 1975. Okay, so the new Act 13 of 2024 replaces the Act 63 of 1975, which was created during the Apartheid era. And you can imagine if something was created during the Apartheid era, it was most definitely absolutely detrimental to the African people and beneficial for the Europeans. The procedures in the Act, the new Expropriation Act, is to allow for regulatory institutions to expropriate lands whenever they deem necessary. The compensation involved is one of the clauses in the Act that caused a lot of problems because there was a nil compensation clause. And it basically means that your land can be taken away from you and you're not going to be compensated. But the only reason why your land could be taken away from you is because it's needed for the benefit of the general public. For example, they are trying to build roads, schools, hospitals, these types of infrastructure, or rather amenities, are necessary for the general public. And in such cases, if you have land that exists where such infrastructure needs to be placed, it could be taken away from you without any compensation. Okay. Also, the act, by the way, I'm going to put the link to the act in the comment section if you're interested, or I can put it in the description of the video for you to take a look for yourself. And by the way, I salute the South African government for putting out that gazette in multiple languages, not only in English. That shows that they have some pride and some dignity and some integrity in who they are, as opposed to what some other African countries do. They've completely thrown out their indigenous languages and replace that with foreign languages that serve no particular benefits, because the countries are still extremely poor and they've still not been able to come out of the mess that they have been in. Okay, so some of the implications of the Expropriation Act is, reversing some historical inequalities that has been going on in South Africa ever since it was created in 1913. I mean, we all know that the indigenous Africans in South Africa have been, they've been at the bottom of the food chain unfairly. There have been multiple government policies over decades that have kept them at the bottom of the barrel. Okay, so this act is to reverse some of those situations. And we understand that the United States government would rather have African people at the bottom of the food chain. That's why their officials under Donald Trump are coming out in large numbers to support the descendants of the settlers. Okay, it's absolutely ridiculous, but you don't need to be upset as an African person. You should be happy because you at least know for a fact that some people are against your progress. They would rather have you at the bottom of the food chain, and it's your own responsibility to find a way to remove yourself from that situation. Okay. Okay. One of the other things that this new expropriation act will achieve is property rights. Okay. There's been a huge debate about the impact of existing property rights, which, like I said, for the most part, it's beneficial to the Europeans that make up only 8% of the population, and the Africans that make up at least 80% of the population. They are always receiving the short end of the stick, consistently poor, consistently jobless. And I understand a lot of these other African people are, we Africans, a lot of us, minus me, obviously, we have a beef with South Africa and South Africans just because of how, we hear about xenophobia, and oftentimes whenever xenophobia occurs, you find South Africans, the poor, underprivileged South Africans, attacking other African nationals within South Africa because they claim that these nationals are the ones taking their jobs and making them poor. But the fact of the matter is, it's the policy of the government, the existence of South Africa in the first place, and how it was structured, beneficial to the European people. The second highest beneficiaries are the so-called colored people. I'm talking about people that are like mixed race or like the Asians and stuff like that. They are the ones that are the second beneficiaries. And the last bottom of the food chain, bottom of the barrel, are the indigenous African people. So it's not the fault of other African immigrants in South Africa that you are poor. It's the fault of how your country is structured. But me personally, I'm not going to be beefing South Africans. I understand it's ignorance. At the same time, we have a lot of upstanding South Africans that are consistently, educating people against xenophobia, educating them about the dynamics of their country, how it is structured, and how the African immigrants in the country are not the reason why they are poor. So I'm not going to be beefing South Africans. If you choose to beef them, fine, that's your business. Okay. Just don't break that to the African Wahala. All right. So, yes. So these are some of the benefits of the Land Expropriation Act. And this is the Gazette here, as you can see on the screen. I'm going to copy this link and post it in the chat, and after the live stream I will post it in the description of the video for you to take a look for yourself. Now, with all the threats by the United States government against South Africa, imposing sanctions, threatening South Africa is going to be the next Zimbabwe, you even have many poor, broke, dusty Americans, obviously European Americans, screaming at the top of their lungs on X. Yes, we're going to make sure you guys are going to be poor for doing that to the Europeans in South Africa. Look at this guy, for example. He says it's a generous offer for from the United States and one that is welcomed. I must, however, urge my fellow South Africans to stay in your country and fight anti whatever racial abuse from an increasingly arrogant, vindictive ACN government. They are not vindictive. You can't call them vindictive for trying to redistribute wealth. You can't have a country where 8% of the population, a group that makes up 8% of the population, is in control of 70% of the wealth. It's not sustainable. It's going to continue causing rife and anger and bitterness. Okay. It's just common sense. And most importantly, evil begets evil. The fact that the original evil began with the invasion of the land by the European settlers, now that evil is not going to be reversed. We have people that are angry at their descendants, people that had nothing to do with it, but their descendants are also sometimes defending the actions of their ancestors because they are beneficiaries of those actions. So it's a mess. It's an absolute mess.
US President Donald Trump has gutted the funding of the United States Agency for International Development, and many across Africa have been losing their minds about this. This is because apparently a large part of what keeps Africa's health systems functional is USAID funding, such as, for example, the PEPFAR program, which funds HIV antiretroviral treatments across many parts of the continent. But is that all there is to USAID in Africa? Is it just a humanitarian organization that concerns itself with trying to make Africa a better place? Or is there something darker going on under the hood? So I decided to take a look at the federal procurement data system to get a sense of what is actually going on here. And this is what I found. Since Donald Trump was inaugurated on January 20, having promised to tackle corruption at USAID, nothing less than 799,000 US dollars has made its way out of USAID Nigeria, being payments to vendors marked as undisclosed or
Now, this is a little bit unrelated. Sorry, I was on mute. I was just speaking to myself, but I was on mute. We are using Nigeria as a case study, and it's still similar to South Africa. If you think about it, if the United States government is threatening South Africa with sanctions. Oh, we are no longer going to give you guys aids. We are no longer going to give you guys money to take care of yourselves. But at the same time, you've been paying these countries money for like 50, 60 years, and these countries remain poor. Then what is the point of the aids? You might as well cut it off and allow the people. It's not even about allowing, it's an opportunity for these recipients of these aids to bounce back and find a way to, you know, become independent, because the aids that they've been receiving for 60 years has kept them poor, poverty stricken. Vast majority of the people are still living the same way that they were. All right. So
miscellaneous. And it gets even worse when you look at the dates. Now, bear in mind that on January 28th, President Trump ordered an immediate freeze on all payments from USAID globally. Now, it turns out that between January 29 and January 30, at least $466,000 of US taxpayer money was sent out by USAID Nigeria to vendors marked as miscellaneous and undisclosed in the 2 days after President Trump's direct instruction to cease all payments. So not only was a direct instruction from the US president blatantly ignored, but these payments were sent out to recipients marked as undisclosed and miscellaneous. Now, this raises all sorts of questions in the Nigerian and in the African context. Where is all this money going? What is all this money being used to do? On what is supposedly the world's poorest continent, where there is this much money flying around, and coincidentally, you also happen to have these very well funded, well armed terror and rebel groups constantly springing up out of the woodwork for no reason in particular. What exactly is going on here? What are we looking at? And this is the question that we're hoping will be answered in the coming days and weeks as the puzzle surrounding what exactly USAID money has been funding around the world is unraveled.
that's a great video from David explaining to us how some of these so-called aids that we've been accepting, for decades from the United States and many other Western countries actually fund the detriment of the African countries.
I mean, if Africans, Francophone African countries, were to decide today that all French companies must get out of Africa, that all the monies that are going to France, estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars annually, if all that funding would stop going to France today, France will immediately become the third world country. And Africa no longer needs to be getting aid from anybody. If you look at the billions of dollars France is getting out of Africa every year, and then the fraction that they give back to Africa in the name of aid, out of what I like to call loot. They loot from us at night, and during the day, they come back and give us a pittance of the loot in the name of aid. It is a joke. And how we Africans have tolerated this for centuries is sad.
It's really that simple. So Yes, the South African Expropriation Act is beneficial for the South African people. At least the vast majority of the people will benefit from it. It's also going to reverse the historical inequities of land ownership in the country and redistribute land for a wider use of the people. And like I said, I posted the Gazette in the chat for you to take a look yourself. I would also put it in the description of the video. Take a look for yourself. Be reasonable, all right? Read it for yourself if you can. It's about 49 pages long, but half of those pages are not even in English, so you can't even understand what it's in there, all right? And most importantly, we need to understand that it's time for African people to, start having that independent mindset. The aids are never going to make you wealthy. These lazy politicians from many African countries that have always relied on aids, not so they can use it to benefit their countries, but so that they can loot that aid. All right. They will get this work. So shout out to South Africa for doing the right thing. And the United States can keep on crying. You can cry all you want. At the end of the day, what's going to happen is the sanctions that you plan to impose on South Africa, yes, it's going to have some detrimental effects at the beginning, but eventually South Africa will bounce back. Part of the reasons is South Africa is in a very strong alliance, one of the core members of BRICS. And this will buffer some of the effects of those temporary sanctions. So let me know what you think about this situation, the Expropriation Act in South Africa, in the comment section. Make sure you click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. Peace.